Well, I'm joined now by France 24's international affairs commentator, Doug Herbert. He's with me now in the studio to talk more about this.
Hi, Angela.
Doug, first of all, give us some context on this. We've been talking about possible hits on this Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant since the beginning.
And mutual accusations, right? It's been a he said, she said, really since the outset of this conflict. The main thing to know is, yes, Zaporizhzhia, Europe's largest nuclear plant, a plant that supplied a fifth of Ukraine's electricity before the Russian invasion in late February, has been essentially occupied by Russians, yet staffed by Ukrainian nuclear engineers since the early days of this conflict. You've had a situation where you've had literally a nuclear plant in the middle of a raging conflict zone. Now, I think to do a service to our viewers here, I think the thing they should take away from this is let's get the both sidesism out of this. In other words, take away the he said, she said, because sure, there are no angels on either side of this conflict. This is war. Obviously, there have been, both sides have committed errors throughout this war. One side is predominantly to blame. I will put that on the record factually. You have a situation in which the external power sources of this plant, which have allowed early on its reactors to run before they were shut down, have been continually bombarded since the early days of this conflict, with only a few pauses, including recently. And the bulk of those bombardments have come from the Russian forces. They may deny it to the hilt, but the shelling has been the Russian forces. And you've had Russia time and again denying it, trying to turn the tables and blame the Ukrainians. And why have they done that? Because it is the quintessential Russian war tactic. You sow confusion. You create alternative facts on the ground. You create uncertainty. You create a debate. You create scenarios like this in which you're asking me, who said what, who did what, who's to blame? In this scenario, you essentially have a situation where the Russian forces have their own people, their own troops within and around that plant. The Ukrainians are working literally almost in a hostage-like situation, the engineers, to keep this plant going. What the Russians have been trying to do is to essentially, and this is the Institute for the Study of War says this, they've been trying to set conditions in order to force the IAEA, the International Nuclear Watchdog, to essentially recognize Russian control of the plant, and by extension, de facto recognize the Russian annexation of this area. Because remember, Zaporizhzhia is one of the three areas that was, along with Kherson and Luhansk, which was annexed in a joke of an annexation recognized by no one recently. This is Russian tactics, and they're working perfectly because here we are talking about it, and we're all confused, and we're all debating who's to blame.
And you've talked a little bit about the Russian position. What are the Ukrainians saying?
Ukrainians have a very straightforward argument. And all along they said, why would we be shelling? Let's even be cynical. Why would we be shelling our own nuclear plant with our own engineers inside? The Ukrainians call this a false flag operation by the Russians. In other words, to be able to turn the blame on the Ukrainians for bombing and shelling their own nuclear plant. Ukrainians say basically, as I said, this was a power plant. This was a plant that helped supply 20% of Ukraine's electricity. The Ukrainians say this amounts to what they say, in their words, the Defense Ministry's spokesperson, a genocidal campaign. His words, a genocidal campaign to, quote, freeze Ukrainians to death and to deprive them of electricity as the winter sets in. You might say outrageous, exaggerated, come on, that's being cynical, that's being biased, that's being one-sided. Look at the context in which this is happening, and we're talking about this today. It's happened that over the past week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we have seen the largest barrage of missile strikes by the Russians, rocket and missile attacks against critical Ukrainian infrastructure across the country, not just in the southern region where Zaporizhzhia is, east, west, south, north, aimed at, and has been successful at relatively, knocking out the energy infrastructure. This is part of that larger plan. As the winter sets in, freezing the combat, the Russians have been on the back foot in the fighting. This is essentially trying to freeze the front, freeze the fighting action, to have a pause, if you will, on the front, and that pause is gained by striking a critical infrastructure. Zaporizhzhia may be a nuclear plant, but it's also part of Ukraine's critical infrastructure, nuclear or not nuclear.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there. Doug Herbert there, our international affairs commentator.